The tea was cheaper. They threw it in the harbour anyway. That is the part of this story nobody teaches, and it's the part that makes everything else make sense. In December 1773, a group of men in Boston destroyed 46 tons of tea that had just become the cheapest tea available in North America. Cheaper than what they had been drinking. Cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea most of them actually bought. So the story you were told that this was a protest against a tax on tea cannot be right. There was no new tax. The duty had been law for 6 years and nobody changed it. What changed was something else entirely. What changed was that the richest corporation in the world had gone bankrupt, and a government 3,000 miles away had decided who was going to make it whole. This story involves a famine and a decision a company made at the height of it that is still hard to read about. It involves one man's bet in London that destroyed 8 banks in a fortnight. A rescue package in 3 parts, none of which anybody in America was asked about. A number that makes the whole event stop making sense until you understand what was really at stake, and at the end of it, a bill sent to a city that never ordered the goods. So let's go back, not to Boston and not to 1773, let's go to Bengal in 1765. By the middle of the 18th century, the English East India Company was not really a company in any sense you'd recognize. It had its own armies, it had its own navy. It negotiated with sovereign states, it fought wars, and it collected taxes. It was a private commercial enterprise that had acquired the functions of a government, and it was owned by shareholders, many of whom sat in the House of Commons. In 1765, following military victories at Plassey and Buxar, the company obtained the Diwani, the Mughal right to collect revenue across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. In practical terms, it became the ruler of one of the wealthiest regions on earth, with the legal authority to tax roughly 30 million people. And it used that authority the way you would expect a company answerable to shareholders to use it. Within a few years, land revenue collections had risen by around 30%. Under company administration, the land tax typically went from 10 or 15% of the value of the agricultural produce to as much as 50%. So here is the ledger. And it's the ledger this whole video runs on. On one side, what the company was owed and what it could extract. On the other side, what it actually held. In 1765, both columns are enormous. That's the point. Nothing about this story makes sense unless you understand that this was, on paper, the most successful commercial enterprise in human history. But look closely at the second column, because there's a crack in it already. The company paid the British government £40,000 a year for the privilege of its monopoly. And from 1768 onward, it could not make that payment. It had been losing tea sales to smugglers for years. By most accounts, something like 85% of the tea drunk in America came in illegally from Dutch suppliers, because Dutch tea sold for around 3 shillings a pound and British tea cost 4 or more. An empire's most important company was already failing to pay its rent. And then the rain didn't come. In 1769, the rice crop in Bengal failed. The monsoon fell short. A smallpox epidemic was already moving through the region. People began leaving their villages, which is what people do when a harvest fails and there is nothing left to eat. None of that is anybody's fault. Crops fail. What happened next is not in that category. The company had, by this point, established monopolies in the grain trade through its own agents. It forbade what it called hoarding, which meant traders and dealers were prevented from building the reserves that in previous lean years had carried the population through. The company had no plan for a grain shortage. The actions it did take were largely concerned with how the shortage affected merchants and trade. And then, in April 1770, with the famine at its worst, the company announced that the following year's land tax would be increased by 10%. Let me be precise about what that means, because it's the kind of sentence that slides past. More revenue was collected from Bengal in the famine year of 1770 to 1771 than in the year of shortage before it. The Governor-General, Warren Hastings, later acknowledged what he described as violent tax collection. How many people died is genuinely not known, and I want to be careful with the number rather than dramatic. The 19th century historian William Wilson Hunter, who wrote the most detailed account, gave a figure of 10 million. Some modern historians have revised that downward substantially to 1 or 2 million. Nobody counted. Counting deaths across rural Bengal in 1770 was not possible, and anyone quoting a precise figure with confidence is guessing. What is documented is this. Hastings himself reported to the company in 1772 that a third of the inhabitants had died. Large areas were depopulated. Cultivated land returned to jungle and stayed that way for decades. I'm not telling you this to establish that the East India Company was wicked, although you're welcome to that conclusion. I'm telling you because of what it did to the balance sheet. The revenue Bengal was supposed to generate, the revenue the company's entire valuation rested on, did not arrive. The obligations did not shrink to match. And in London, where nobody had seen any of this, the share price began to move. In June 1772, a man named Alexander Fordyce made a bet. Fordyce was a partner in a London banking house, and he had taken a large position against East India Company stock, betting the price would fall. It rose. He lost around £300,000, leaving his partners liable for an estimated £243,000 more. Then he fled the country. What happened over the following 2 weeks is one of the fastest financial collapses in British history. As the news spread, depositors ran. 8 London banks failed inside a fortnight. Around 20 more across Europe followed. Britain's money markets froze. Merchants and manufacturers could not obtain short-term credit at any price. Infrastructure projects that had been financed by rolling short-term debt, canals, toll roads, the physical apparatus of the early industrial economy simply stopped. Imports to England and Scotland fell 14% between 1772 and 1773. And among the casualties, in a detail that would be funny if it weren't so bleak, was George Colebrook, the chairman of the East India Company himself. He had been speculating too. He went bankrupt and, like Fordyce, fled to France. Now look at the ledger again. The column marked "Owed" has not moved. The company still owes the government its $40,000 a year, still owes the Bank of England, still has creditors who now urgently want paying. The column marked "Held" has collapsed. Bengal is not producing what it was supposed to produce. Credit has vanished, and the warehouses in London are stacked to the ceiling with tea nobody is buying. By 1772, the East India Company was insolvent, facing dissolution, and petitioning Parliament for relief. And this is where the story stops being about India and starts being about Boston. Parliament had a real problem here, and it's worth stating fairly rather than sneering at it. The company was not a normal firm. Let it fail, and it takes a substantial part of a financial system that had just demonstrated exactly how fragile it was. Let it fail, and British position in India goes to the French, and a great many influential men, including members of the House itself, held the stock. There is a phrase for this argument, and it was already being made in 1772, long before anyone used the word bailout. The company's lobbyists told Parliament that the empire could not afford to let it fall over. Parliament's own committees had reported severely on the company's conduct. Lord North said publicly that its territory would be better run by the Crown than by directors he thought incapable of governing it. So Parliament spent weeks debating whether to let it fail. And then it didn't let it fail. According to Colonial Williamsburg's account, the rescue came in 3 parts. First, a loan to cover the immediate shortfall. The Regulating Act of 1773 provided £1.5 million and capped the dividends the company could pay. Second, a reduced duty on tea entering the North American colonies to make the price attractive. Third, and this is the one that matters, Parliament reinforced the company's monopoly on selling tea in North America. Read that third item again, because it is the whole story in one line. The solution to a British corporation's insolvency was to guarantee it a market on the other side of the Atlantic, among people who had not been consulted, did not hold its shares, and had spent the previous decade arguing that Parliament had no authority to make decisions of this kind on their behalf. And here is where everything I've told you needs to turn over. Because if you've been following this, expecting the story to end with tea becoming expensive, it doesn't. It ends with tea becoming cheap. Substantially cheaper. Rick Atkinson puts the drop at more than a third, undercutting the smuggled Dutch, Danish and Portuguese tea that most Americans were actually drinking. So the question is not why were the colonists angry about the price of tea? They weren't. The tea was cheap. That was the threat. A duty nobody notices is a duty nobody resists. A tax that arrives inside a bargain gets paid without argument, and a principle you concede out of convenience is a principle you have already lost. Boston did not destroy that cargo because accepting it would have been painful. Boston destroyed that cargo because accepting it would have been reasonable. Let's look at what the Tea Act actually said, because the details are sharper than the summary. It received royal assent on the 10th of May, 1773, 13 George III, Chapter 44, introduced by Lord North. Its formal title concerns allowing a drawback of customs duties on tea exported to America and empowering the Treasury to license the company to export tea duty-free. Three things followed from it. 1. The company could ship tea directly to the colonies for the first time rather than selling at auction in London and letting the trade find its own way across. That removed a layer of cost and a layer of tax. 2. The company could appoint its own agents in America, consignees, to receive and sell the tea. That eliminated the British wholesalers and, more importantly, the colonial merchants who had made their living in that gap. A named list of men in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston were about to be handed the exclusive right to sell a product every household in America consumed. And the reaction came from a direction that tells you everything. It was reported from New York at the time that the loudest opponents of the Tea Act were the smugglers, because the legal tea had become so cheap that smuggling was no longer worth doing. Hold on to that, because it is the whole story in one sentence said out loud in 1773 by somebody watching it happen. And 3. The 3p per pound duty from the Townshend Acts stayed exactly where it was. That duty is worth pausing on, because it is the strangest artifact in this entire story. The Townshend duties had been repealed in 1770 on everything: glass, lead, paper, paint, except tea. Tea was kept, deliberately, not because the revenue mattered, but to maintain Parliament's claim to the right of taxation. And in 1773, most of Parliament wanted it gone. It was a nuisance, it complicated the rescue, and it earned almost nothing. Lord North personally refused. So both sides of what became a war were, at this point, arguing over a tax that neither of them wanted for the money. Now here is the number the story turns on. Before the Act, smuggled Dutch tea sold in the colonies at around 3 shillings a pound. British tea cost 4 shillings or more, which is why almost nobody bought it legally. After the Act, with the middlemen gone and the export duties waived, legal British tea, including the 3p, undercut the smuggled product. The colonies were importing over £1 million of tea a year. Every household in America was about to be offered a better price than it had ever been able to get from a company that had just been rescued by a parliament they did not elect. Think about who that destroys. It destroys the colonial merchant who imported legally and sold at a markup because he is now cut out of his own trade. It destroys the smuggler whose entire margin has just evaporated. And it puts enormous pressure on the men who had spent 10 years arguing that Parliament could not tax America without America's consent, because their neighbours were about to be offered a very good deal in exchange for quietly abandoning the argument. John Hancock was a merchant. So were a great many of the men who organised what happened next. I'm not going to pretend that's irrelevant, it isn't, and any honest account has to say it. But the reverse claim, that this was purely smugglers protecting their profits, is just as false. The Act threatened a commercial interest and a constitutional principle at the same time, which is precisely why the coalition against it held. 7 ships had sailed from London in late September, nearly 2,000 chests, around £544,000 of tea, bound for 4 American cities. In Philadelphia and New York, pressure worked the way pressure usually works. Crowds gathered, the consignees resigned, and the ships turned around and sailed home without unloading a chest. In Charleston, the tea was landed, and when nobody paid the duty, customs seized it and locked it in a warehouse. 3 years later, the colonists sold it to raise money for the war against Britain. 4 ships were sent to Boston. 1, the William, ran aground off Cape Cod. The other 3, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, tied up at Griffin's Wharf. So why Boston? Every other port solved this without destroying anything. Part of the answer is that Boston's consignees would not resign. Among them were Thomas and Elisha Hutchinson, the sons of the royal governor. In November, they and the others took refuge in Castle William rather than give up their commissions. But the decisive fact is the governor himself, and it isn't what you'd assume. Once the Dartmouth had entered at the customs house, she could not leave the harbour without a clearance from the collector. Thomas Hutchinson refused to grant one, and the guns at Castle William commanding the channel made sure the refusal held. In Philadelphia, the ships could leave. In Boston, the governor had shut the door behind them, and he did it on purpose, for a reason that was entirely coherent. Under the customs law, a ship had 20 days from entry to pay its duty. After that, officials could seize the cargo and land it. Hutchinson expected exactly that. The clock runs out, customs takes the tea, the consignees pay the 3p to get it back, and Parliament's right to tax America is upheld in practice rather than argued about. He was not being stubborn. He had found a way to win the constitutional argument by simply waiting. For the Dartmouth, the 20th day was the 16th of December. On that day, several thousand people in a town of about 16,000 gathered at the Old South Meeting House. A last request went to Hutchinson asking him to let the ships sail. He refused again. That evening, a group of men, some of them disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded the three ships. Estimates of how many vary widely. Accounts give anywhere from 30 to 130, with around 60 most commonly cited. They worked for roughly 3 hours. They broke open 342 chests and emptied them into the harbour. Around 92,000 pounds of tea, roughly 46 tons. And here is the detail that tells you what kind of event this actually was. They damaged nothing else. They took nothing. One man caught filling his coat with tea was stripped of it on the spot. They swept the decks afterwards and, by several accounts, replaced a padlock they had broken. This was not a riot. It was a demolition, carried out with the specific intention of destroying one particular cargo and leaving everything around it visibly intact. The message was not "we are out of control." The message was "we will not accept this specific thing and we are able to be precise about it." The East India Company later reported its loss at £9,659. Now, there's one more part of this, and it's the part your history class almost certainly skipped. Because Britain's response was not to reconsider the rescue, it was to send someone the bill. In the spring of 1774, Parliament passed a series of measures the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The first of them was the Boston Port Bill. It closed the port of Boston completely, all commercial shipping in and out, and it would stay closed until the destroyed tea had been paid for. Look at the shape of that. A corporation ran up losses in Bengal and London. Parliament converted those losses into a market guarantee in America. America refused the guarantee and destroyed the goods. And Parliament then converted the loss a second time into a debt owed by a city enforced by closing its harbour. Twice. The same instinct. A company's shortfall is a real obligation that somebody must discharge, and the somebody is whoever has the least ability to refuse. And it did not work, for a reason that should have been obvious. Boston in 1773 was one contentious town with a reputation for causing trouble, and plenty of colonists elsewhere thought the tea business had gone too far. Destroying private property was not universally popular. Virginia planters were not natural allies of Massachusetts radicals. But closing a port indefinitely until a debt was paid was a thing that could be done to any port. That was the moment the argument stopped being about Boston. The colonies sent food and money to a city they had been arguing with weeks earlier, and in September 1774 the First Continental Congress met. The bill was never paid. The port stayed shut until the war made the question irrelevant. I want to be careful before I finish, because a story like this can be pushed into shapes it doesn't fit. This is not a claim that the American Revolution was really about corporate welfare and everything else was decoration. It wasn't. A decade of constitutional argument sits underneath it. The Stamp Act, the Townsend Duties, the Boston Massacre, the question of what representation actually requires. The tea crisis is a trigger inside a much longer chain, and anyone selling you a single cause for a revolution is selling you something. And the honest reading is that nobody here is a fool. The company was trying to survive. North was trying to save a strategic asset without abandoning a principle. The merchants were protecting businesses. The radicals were protecting an argument they had already made 100 times. But the narrow claim holds, and it's the one the schoolbook gets wrong. The Boston Tea Party was not a protest against a tax. There was no new tax. It was a protest against a rescue. The decision to make an insolvent company solvent again by handing it a market that belonged to people who had no vote in the matter. The tea went into the water not because it cost too much, but because it cost too little. It was the first time a colony told an empire that a company's losses were not its debt to settle. And if that arrangement sounds familiar, a private firm too entangled to fail, a public rescue nobody voted on, and a bill that lands somewhere downstream of the people who made the decision, I'll leave that where it is. You don't need me to draw the line. What I'd rather leave you with is the thing the Bostonians understood and Lord North did not. A bargain is the most effective way to end an argument. Make something cheap enough and reasonable enough, and people stop objecting to how it arrived. Which is why, occasionally, somebody has to do something that looks completely irrational, like destroying 46 tons of the cheapest tea in America in order to keep the argument alive. If you want more of this, subscribe. This is Broken Promises, a series that takes the events everybody thinks they understand and follows the money underneath them. And I want your answer to a real disagreement, not a rhetorical one. Were the Boston radicals defending a constitutional principle that genuinely could not survive being made convenient? Or were the men who organized it merchants and smugglers whose businesses the Tea Act was about to destroy, with the principle as useful cover? Historians have argued both, and the evidence supports more of each than either side likes to admit. Tell me where you land, and why. I read them. Next time on Broken Promises, 50 years before any of this, the same Parliament did something considerably stranger. It handed the entire British national debt, the accumulated cost of decades of war, to a private company whose actual trading business was close to non-existent. Then it watched the share price rise nearly tenfold in 7 months, and watched what happened to everybody who believed it. That one's next.